Hello, and welcome to this technical session on Trend Micro's XDR. My name is Bhavin Gandhi, and I'm a senior SE based in Dubai. Hope you are having a fruitful day listening to all the sessions today from our team members. So let's begin. I would like to just touch upon a brief view on XDR before we start the lab sessions. With today's ever-evolving threat landscape, advanced security is not enough to prevent attacks on your users and infrastructure. You need ability or capabilities to help you respond rapidly to these threats that may breach your defenses. Today, many organizations use multiple separate security layers to detect threats across their endpoints, servers, network, email, cloud infrastructure, and so on, leading to siloed threat information and an overload of uncorrelated alerts at times. Detection and response is a vital security requirement for all organizations. But the truth is, most organizations are resource and skill set constrained. We don't have the right kind of resources. If we have the resources, they are not trained enough to identify these threats and respond to it. Single vector solutions make this problem more prevalent. So Trend Micro's XDR collects and automatically correlates data across multiple security layers, which includes email, endpoints, servers, cloud workloads, networks. With a combined context, events that seem benign on their own suddenly become more meaningful indicators of compromise. And you can quickly contain the impact, which helps minimizing the severity and the scope. So by correlating events from Trend Micro products, fewer high confidence alerts are sent, reducing the triage effort required by security analysts. This leads to better earlier detection. One single place for investigation also simplifies the steps to view an entire chain of events. Trend Micro XDR applies uh, effective analytics to activity data from native products to produce actionable alerts. Let's take an example of PowerShell activity that may not necessarily generate an alert, right? Just as an example. But when combined with other activities in the environment, like a mail coming in, user clicking a link, the link asking the user to download something, or it automatically downloads something, right? So when you piece all these piece all this information together, it can help to identify uh, these malicious threats. So let's begin our first use. Okay, so to begin with, this is the XDR console. I will quickly give you an overview of the console first. So let me just log in my console. Okay, so this is the dashboard or the first page which you see when you log into the console. Let's have a quick look. Like I said, so it comprises of multiple different apps, which you can see here, starting with the detection model management. That's the first one which you see on the left side here. This is the heart of the solution. So advanced detection models are written by Trend Micro threat researchers, which correlate activities within or across the security layers to find those undiscovered attacks. The detection models, which generate the alert triggers, combine multiple different rules, filters, using a variety of analysis techniques, which also include data stacking and machine learning in the backend. You can turn on or off the individual models as it suits your environment, or it depends on the organization's risk tolerance and the preferences which you may have, right? The next app is the Threat Intelligence app. It integrates up to the minute intelligence reports from Trend Micro and third parties to help you identify the threats. So when enabled, the Trend Micro XDR parses your event logs, matches the data against the intelligence reports, and generates alerts based on threat detections. So to enable or disable threat intelligence sweeping, you can go to the detection model here. So there is the very first detection model is based on threat intel. And if you disable this, it wouldn't work, right? So generally, or as a best practice, we would recommend keeping this model turned on as well. Next up is the search app. Now, proactively search through endpoints, email, network, and cloud workload activity data. So when I say activity data, it is, example would be telemetry, NetFlow, metadata, using a simple query. So for example, I can just go here, filter out anything specific which I want to search for. So I can maybe have a URL typed here, or maybe I can have a file name. I can search specifically on, say, email only. I don't want network and endpoint data to be shown. So I will check this out, and I have a couple of options related to email here. Or if I only want endpoint, I can filter that, and it will show me the options which are available for endpoints right here. And it is a combination of activity data and the detections as well. Next up is the response management app. Now, the response management app shows the response action on specific targets, right? So it could be endpoint isolation, or it could be a request to quarantine a particular mail. So there are a couple of requests which you see on the screen here, right? So if I click on any one of these, somebody tried to collect some file which was found to be malicious from the endpoint, or it could be, like I said, a request to quarantine an email as well, right? Next app is the Workbench. The Workbench shows a list of alerts or workbenches and drill down for which you can drill down into for further visibility, right? So as part of today's demo, we will be having a look at how the Workbench triggers an alert also, right? It helps to quickly understand the story of an attack with a visual representation of a threat. So workbenches are investigation results for a detection, where you can look at the execution profile, you can identify the scope of the impact, you can take response actions. So response action could be, like I said, isolation of endpoints, quarantining of emails, or collection of more details from the endpoint, like collecting files and stuff. This is where you prioritize and process the alerts and track what has been done, right? So whether so for example, when I say what has been done in terms of whether it's a new event, or it's something which is still in progress, somebody is looking at it, or it has been closed by the SOC analyst, or it was a false positive, right? So these are the different actions which you can set for individual workbenches. For today's session, I have integrated multiple different solutions of Trend Micro with Xdr Console, right? So that product connector option here will show you the integration of the different Trend Micro products. I have also set up a couple of test mailboxes and a few endpoints, which are protected by the endpoint security solution as well. And I have cloud workloads, which I will use for today's demo as well. So let's begin with the first demo. All right, everyone. So for this first demo, we will be using the endpoints now. I have my Apex One integrated with XDR, like I mentioned earlier. In this use case, I will use the command prompt with admin privileges. The command which I'm going to use is to dump credentials via the command line. So what happens is that the adversaries attempt to dump credentials typically to obtain account logins, normally in the form of a hash or a clear text password from the operating system. And of course, they use this command to steal these credentials. So the credentials can then be used to perform lateral movement and access restricted information on maybe endpoints or some other servers. MITRE also lists this technique. They call it the OS credential dumping technique, which is used by adversaries. To execute this technique, the attacker needs admin or root level permissions on the target first. Hash dumpers, as they call themselves, open the security accounts manager on the local file system, or create a dump of the registry SAM key to access the stored account password hashes. Okay, so let's try using it. I have this endpoint here. I will go to the command prompt, open it with admin privileges. There we go. I'm going to use this preset SAM command. Oops, let me just copy it again. Copy, paste, enter. Ignore the error for the time being, right? We'll go back to our console, the Xdr console. Xdr console should show us a workbench shortly. All right, I'll just do a quick refresh of the page, and we should have the workbench. Perfect. So now we have the workbench here. This severity of this particular model is high. It is affecting different endpoints, right? When we look into the details of this particular workbench, so it shows you what has happened on the endpoint. So this is the endpoint which is affected. This is the user with which I have logged in, right? And this is the command which I ran on this particular endpoint. And it also connects back to another endpoint of mine, right? So these are the details which it will show you when you drill down into the workbench, right? It also shows you the details of the MITRE technique at the bottom here. So what rule or what threat model triggered? It was credential dumping. Within that model, there is a particular rule which is possible credential dumping via command line, because I use the command line to dump credentials. And like I said, you have the link to the MITRE page as well, right? So when you click on it, it opens up the MITRE page, which will give you more details about what this particular technique is for getting more information on that. Now, what you can also do is you can go to the search option. Filter out the endpoint part. Let's keep the activity data. And at the bottom, you have the CLI command, right? So let me just copy paste that command here. And I can do a search as well. So now the search will also give me some details about what happened on that endpoint. So if I want to just drill down or get some information based on IOCs or IOAs, which I have, I can do that as well, right? So this is the search option on the Xdr console as well. Now let's look at the second part of this attack, if I may call it, right? What would happen is, after credential dumping, typically an attacker would want to move laterally. Like I said earlier, they would want to move onto other endpoints, or they would move onto some servers. They would keep searching, right? So once I have some details with me, I would want to do maybe an RDP. I have another endpoint of mine, which is running on 172.16.7.7. I will do an RDP to this particular server, right? So say, for example, in this case, I of course know the credentials, so I will log in and my RDP is successful, right? Now what happens is, after a successful credential dumping attempt, right, the attacker is trying to move laterally. right? Adversaries are, may exploit remote services or to gain unauthorized access. So the exploitation of a software vulnerability occurs when an adversary takes advantage of maybe a programming error or a service or within operating system software or kernel itself. A common goal for post-compromise exploitation of the remote services is for lateral movement, right? So let's wait for a couple of minutes and we should see a workbench which will show the lateral movement as well. All right, so here we have the second workbench, which is lateral movement after credential dumping. So this was the credential dumping workbench, and then the adversary did a lateral movement. Now we can click on that workbench and see the details of what exactly happened, right? So if I spread out this a little, so this was my initial machine where I had logged in. From there, I did a lateral movement. I first dumped the credentials and then I did a lateral movement, right? Using RDP, I went onto this machine, right? So now when we look at the workbench here, you have the credential dumping via command line followed by an RDP connection. And like I mentioned earlier, you would have the details of the MITRE techniques as well, right? So if you want to further drill down into the details of what each technique means and how the adversaries would use it, you would get these details from the MITRE page itself. So this is how an endpoint which is compromised using a credential dumping as a mechanism, using a lateral movement wherein the attacker or the adversary would jump from one endpoint to another endpoint can be identified using Xdr as a console, right? So this is the endpoint piece, just one example to just give you the look and feel of how Xdr can be beneficial. Okay, so one more thing which I wanted to highlight here is that when you have these detections, right, a typical a question which would come up is that how do you respond to it? I know that these are the low-lying threats which I have identified, which typically went unnoticed, or my traditional security solutions may have missed it, or my SIM solutions or the SOC analyst did not see it. But when I see this workbench here, let me just rearrange this workbench a little. Right, so I have this workbench here. Now I know that I have seen these detections. There is an endpoint which is infected or is creating havoc in my network. How do I respond to these threats? So one of the things which I can do is I can maybe isolate the endpoint from here itself. So I can notify my endpoint solution that, okay, there is an agent running. So I give it a reason and just say create. So the moment I create this task, it will notify Apex 1 to notify the endpoint agent to isolate this endpoint from the network. That is one thing. Or say if I have this IOC here, I can add it to a block list, right? So I would just right click on it and I would say, I want to put this IOC, this SHA-1, which I have captured into the block list of my Cloud App Security or Apex One as a service. So this would immediately notify both these products that henceforth, if you come across this particular IOC or this particular hash value, you will just completely block this out, right? So that is what I wanted to share with you guys earlier. All right. Now to continue our session, let's move on to the data center security. Data center security is for protecting the most critical asset in an organization, that those are the servers. So, and let's see how XDR can help visualize the threats which are there in the data center. XDR, just to reiterate again, helps reduce the number of events for SOC analysts to work on. We will try and simulate 2 or 3 scenarios for the data center piece. The first one I have is credential dumping using Mimikatz. So it's a PowerShell command, which is using Mimikatz. It's downloaded from a GitHub repository. The technique is similar to what we saw in the endpoint. use case, but the method is slightly different because it uses PowerShell. It uses a free repository like GitHub from where the code is downloaded. So what I have here is a Windows server which is protected by Trend Micro Cloud One workload security. What I will do is I will open the command prompt. I have the command which is to be used. So I will just paste the command here, right? So just to give you an idea, like I said, it's a PowerShell executable command which connects to a GitHub repo. So if you see, there is a URL which is mentioned here, which will download the mimikatz, which will try and exploit. So it's a PowerShell script which tries to exploit and dump the credentials from the server. Let's execute it. Right, so the command executed. If you see, it's, let's just scroll up. Right, so it's a mimikatz PowerShell script, and it tries to fetch the domain, the admin credentials, and all the other required credentials from the system. Let's move on to our console, the Xdr console. Right, so on the Xdr console here, what we have is the Workbench. Let's give it a couple of more minutes for the Workbench to appear. Oops, let me just go back to my window. Sorry for that. Right, so here we have the Workbench now, credential dumping. Let's check out the Workbench. So when we look at the Workbench, it shows the command, the username with which I have logged in. This is an EC2 instance, by the way, on AWS, which I'm using. So it's a credential dumping model which triggered, within which there is a credential dumping via command line. So this is the command which I executed, right? So it picks up the command, it shows all the details here. And now it becomes very easy for the SOC analyst to identify that what exactly happened on this server, right? So that's where XDR Workbench would help, right? Moving on, let's move on to the second use case. All right, so let's look at the second use case now. In the second use case, we are trying to identify file obfuscation. So adversaries may use obfuscated files or information to hide artifacts of an intrusion so that an analyst is not able to pick it up. It is, they try to obfuscate the files in such a way that that intrusion is not identified by any of the security tools. So they may require separate mechanisms to decode or de-obfuscate the information depending on how they intend to use it. Methods for doing that include built-in functionality within the OS itself, or it could be some malware which is planted on the target system. It could be either an endpoint or it could be a server in our case. So one such example is to use the built-in utility of Windows, which is the cert util, to decode a remote access tool portable executable file that has been hidden inside the file system. So let's run this command and see what the Xdr console shows us. So again, I have the command. Let me just fetch that command. Right, so here is the command. Let me just copy paste it. Yeah, so if you see, I'm using the certutil executable from within the operating system itself. So though this command fails, let's see what we can see on the Xdr console, on what it exactly picks up. Let's just give it a few minutes for the Xdr console to pick up the events. All right, so here we have the file deobfuscation, the threat model. Let's drill into it. So what do we see here? I have my EC2 instance again, right? And the command which I executed. So if I want to just see the details of the command, they're right here. Now I can also right click on it and I can add it to exceptions also if I want to ignore this particular command or any other command for that matter, right? If it's a detection and you feel that it requires to be excluded from Xdr console or Xdr console detecting that particular command, you can do that as well. But again, so this is the threat model which triggered, and it used certutil, right? So this is the particular rule within the threat model which triggered. And like before, when you click on it, it opens the threat MITRE attack page, which gives you more detail about what that particular command is or what that threat model is and why it is important, right? So this is the second use case which we saw. Just going back to the console. So one was credential dumping on the server using Mimikatz, and the second one is the file deobfuscation, where certutil as a utility within the operating system has been used. All right, moving on to the third use case. For the third use case, what we are going to use is a Linux server. Okay, so I have another instance in AWS again, which I have logged into. So if you can see my console, and what I am going to do is again use a cron job, which will what it basically does is it will execute a daemon every minute. It tries to retrieve a payload from a command and control server. I will show you the command as well. And after it gets a payload, it executes that payload silently. And this task or this job has been created in such a way that if every minute it will try to do a connection back to the command and control server. So the command for that, I have it here. And if you see this, it tries to connect to a particular URL, which is lsd systemtxn.org, right? So depending on whether that particular website is available or not, it will try to fetch commands from there, right? So let me just copy this, move on to my Linux machine, and I will paste it here. There we go, right? So there you have the command. It's a silent command, so I will just press enter. Nothing is seen on the console, right? Give it a couple of minutes and let's go back to our Xdr console in the meantime. Okay, so let's go to the Workbench and check. There you go, right? So what threat model was triggered is the remote payload execution via a cron job. Let's get into the details of it and see what it shows. All right. Right, so here we go. Right. The reason it is showing you two servers is because I had tried it on a different EC2 instance earlier as well, right? So anyways, so what this particular threat model does is that it shows you two parts to it. There are two parts to this particular detection. The rules which are triggered are the new cron job created. So there was a cron job which was created. So there were two parts to the command itself. And then it's a remote payload execution. So it downloads something from a CNC server and tries to execute it on the target machine or the target server, right? So two different rules have been triggered. Both have a different technique details. So if you click on it, it shows it's a scheduled task or a job, because like I said, every minute it's going to execute that same command. And the second piece of it is it's an ingress tool transfer. So I'm trying to get something from a particular website and trying to install it on my server, right? So this is how the workbench is created in the third use case. One more thing which I wanted to just highlight in, okay, so we can again go back to this workbench. And there's one more thing which I wanted to show you is, no, it isn't the previous one. Right, so when I click on this, I can get a detailed profile for a machine which has been identified. So it will show me what kind of a machine it is, what's the name of the machine, the IP address, the GUID, what kind of an operating system it is using, and the other details as well. And I had tried this command on a different machine. So that is why you see this number 2 on the top. So when you click on this, it will show you two more other servers where the same command has been executed, right? So these are the kind of details which the Xdr workbench can show you on the console. Now we will move on to the next bit. All right. So now for the final use case for the day, we will try and create a workbench, which is a combination of two different products, which is an email security and the endpoint as well. So for this particular setup, I have two endpoints, right? I have configured the mailboxes, and we will have a look at the workbench as well. And for this for this particular demo, I will send a mail with a malicious URL and a file as an attachment. The URL is a sample URL already flagged as malicious. The file is a batch file with a PowerShell script to hide a malicious code within it and a persistent change which it makes to the registry, right? So to trigger that, I will compose a mail. This is my URL for demo. So I'll copy and paste, right? I have my other users mailbox. I'll say check the link and file. I will attach the file. So I have a zip file which is password protected. It's basically a batch file, like I said, and I will send it out, right? So once this goes, I should see that mail on my other users, in my other users mailbox. So let me dismiss it. Let me just say, save the file, go to my documents, save it. Since I've been asked to check the link, I will click on the link. It opens in Microsoft Edge. And if you see this, it's already a test URL. So it's already been rated internally. And let's go and downloads and documents. Okay, documents. I will say Open the archive. That's my batch file. Say extract. Okay. Password. Yes to all. Minimize this. And here is the batch file. Let me just run it as an admin. All right, so it does some changes. It had certain PowerShell script, like I said, and it got picked up as well by the malicious behavior of the endpoint as well. Right, now we'll shift back to our Xdr console, and let's see once we have the workbench here. Right, so give it a couple of minutes. Okay, so let's refresh the screen and see if there is a workbench. And here we go. Right, so this is the workbench, a little bigger and messier, but great. So we'll have a lot of details here. What it shows is that it is a possible APT attack. So this is the threat model which it triggered. The reason being that there was a mail which came in, there was a URL, there was a file which was downloaded. The file had two components to it. One, it would create a registry entry, which is a persistent registry entry, and there is a batch file also which tries to connect to a CNC server and stuff like that, right? So the workbench shows us a lot of details, but when you look at the bits and pieces of it, you see that there is an uncommon registry entry creation. So there was a registry entry because of the file which I executed. There were certain domains which were there in the mail, and which I clicked upon, and of course the mail details also. And if you see this, this is related to the PowerShell command, which was also a part of the batch file. When you click on each of these, it will show you which all pieces it is trying to connect, right? So this was my endpoint. There was a PowerShell here. Let me just shift the bits a little, right? This was the URL which was visited. This was another machine which I would have tested on, right? This is the URL here. You have, right, here you go, a little better view. So there was a mail which came to XDR3, which was my email ID, which received the mail. The user's machine, the machine had certain persistent registry entries which are changed, right? And of course, I clicked on the URL, so it opened a browser, and the user went to a particular URL. There was a PowerShell script which was executed on the endpoint as well. So all these components are a part of the workbench. One more last thing which I wanted to show you is these details can also be seen here in the search app, which I had shown you earlier as well. So if I type the file name here, so wp.7z was my file, and if I search for it, it gives me a little more detailed information in terms of which were the endpoints. So I use this endpoint to create the file and send it. So it shows me that this endpoint also has a copy of the file, or there are some artifacts which are there on this endpoint. Plus, this is the endpoint which received it. So on this endpoint, of course, I did a lot of things. I created, downloaded the batch file, went to a URL. So all those details are listed here. It also shows me the email activity. So I can drill down into it. I can see who was the sender, who was the recipient, right? What was the subject, right? And the mailbox ID, right? When was it received, date and time, and the email detections as well, other detections. So if this email was received in the past, because I did the tests before as well, just to ensure it works, it will show me the earlier details as well, right? So details in terms of the file hash, it will show me the attachments hash value, MD5, SHA-1, right? It shows me the file name, and the UID. So these are the two mailboxes, right? So this particular mailbox was the recipient, and this is the one which sent or created the mail. So these details are fetched from the O365 integration with Trend Micro Cloud App Security, right? So this is what I wanted to show you today in all these different use cases. So just to wrap it up, XDR again is a cross-layered detection and response solution. XDR collects and automatically correlates data across multiple security layers like endpoint, email, server, cloud workloads, network. So threats can be detected faster, and security analysts can improve the investigation and the response times. So it helps overcome the typical SOC challenges like alert overload or visibility gaps, and helps reduce MTTI, which is the mean time to identify, and MTTR, which is the mean time to respond. Having a graphical attack-centric timeline view can provide answers in many places, like we just saw in today's session, how the user got infected, what was the first point of entry, who else is part of the same attack, right? So multiple different endpoints, where the threat originated, how the threat spread within the environment. So one user receives a mail, another user also got the same mail, or a file was downloaded, multiple different endpoints received that file, how many other users have access to the same thread. All this information is available in a single console, the Xdr console. So that is what I wanted to share. So with that, I would like to wrap up today's session. Hope it was helpful. Hope you got an understanding of how Trend Micro XDR works, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, stay safe,